Welcome to Behind the Teams. I'm your host, Nicole Howe. My career has been defined by a search for what separates the good from great. I've explored this on the court as a professional athlete, through the lens of psychology throughout my studies, and now from the inside of product and design recruitment. On this podcast, we sit down with leaders to explore their behaviours and beliefs around high performance and what their approach is to building great teams. On this episode, I sit down with Candice Pendergast, the head of digital at Future Group. Candice has spent over 2 decades building digital functions within complex organisations. In this conversation, we dig into what high performance really looks like when you strip away the buzzwords. We explored how she manages performance and well-being of her team members and how she intervenes when either starts to slip. We also looked at AI, not as an efficiency play, but we talked about how she's thinking of it as a growth lever and what that means for the humans on her team long term. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Candice, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Really excited to get into this conversation with you, but I might throw it to you first just to give listeners a bit of an overview of yourself.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Candice. I head up digital at Future Group. Future Group, if you don't know, we're a super focused business. So we're part of the ethical investment movement in Australia. And our whole thing, which I love, is really about using the power of money to build a more sustainable, more equitable world. And we're obviously in superannuation and retirement savings. So the phrase that we use is we're building a future worth retiring into. And that runs across, we've got 5 brands. So Future Super, Verve, Childcare Super, which is obvious what it is, Guild Super, pharmacies, and then Smart Monday, which is a corporate super brand. But I think myself, I've been working in and around digital for, showing my age, around 20 odd years now. I've done that across, a lot of different industries. So financial services, telco, I've done e-commerce, retail. I think I even did a stint in the arts at one point. So a whole bunch and range of different industries. But I think what I really do is build the digital function inside of those businesses. So I guess that includes the strategy and how we actually interact with our members or our customers. But it's also the team structures and the individuals that are actually going to deliver on those strategies as well. I think what I've found over the years is I tend to get pulled into businesses where digital is meant to do the heavy lifting on growth, but it isn't quite there yet. Probably one of the hardest versions of that I've actually ever come across. I think if you look across the superannuation industry, digital is pretty undercooked, I guess, particularly if you consider the rest of financial services like banks and whatnot that have a real focus on their digital experience. But super is a low engagement industry by default. So it's almost designed that way. But I think that the challenge that I love in this particular role is that, I think if you look at it, super is actually members' physical money, and people maybe don't think about it that way. But, I look at it as if they deserve to know and understand what's happening with their money, both from, their own financial prosperity, but also in terms of how funds are using their money out there in the world. But I think, coming back to my career and, where I'm at, I think I've found the longer that I do this, the more I realize the work isn't really around what you're putting out there and the strategy. I think that the work is actually the team. And so I think it's getting the right people, getting the structure right, and building a culture where they can actually do the work. And I feel like that's where most of my energy goes now.
Yeah. On that note, how would you define what a high-performing team looks like to you?
Yeah, really, really good question. It's actually really interesting because it's something that you and I, we're talking about this even before we hit record today in terms of some of the things that you and I have bonded over. And that's high performance sport, right? So, you're in basketball, me in netball. I'm an umpire, but, we've both been involved and I'm still involved to a certain degree until I retire in some of those high performance environments. And I think, as you would know, in those environments, I don't think anyone just talks about high performance as one concept. I think people talk about high performance behaviours, right? So if we want to tie it back to sport, you might talk about your discipline in terms of your training, making sure You do your prehab, get a good warm up in. Your nutrition is so important. Recovery, sleep, how you take on feedback, how you review your games and improve your performance. And I think the assumption, and I guess the theory, is if you get those behaviors right, the outcomes will follow. So the outcomes actually become the lag indicator, but the behavior is the leading indicator. And so I think about high performance in, the area that I'm in, product technology design, in exactly the same way. So some of those behaviors in, when it comes to this area is maybe like curiosity, right? A willingness to try, like how do people move around constraints rather than hiding behind them? Like, for example, I'll make up an analogy, I guess. Like let's say that there's a data point that you need to be able to move an initiative forward, and you've talked to the data team, and they can't get it to you for the next 6 months. I think some of those high performance behaviors would drive that person to go, you know what do I have access to? What skills can I take on myself to be able to get, or at least get a bit down the way in terms of being able to get that data point? So it's that behavior. So I think how you perform matters as much as whether you perform when it comes to high performance. And so if you only measure output, I think you're focusing on the wrong thing. And, behavior is the test of high performance.
It's such a good point and a good distinction to make, because I think in sport, obviously, we're all moving towards a shared goal, right? But how you get there and the ability to sustain it, I think, is sometimes something that's missed in business. Like, it's not just about hitting a target once, it's about kind of getting there and staying there and being consistent. And you can't do that when you're not putting in all the stuff that you've just mentioned beforehand. Like, it's not the outcomes, it's all the behaviors that will lead to that. I think sometimes that's missed. There's no kind of focus around sustainability of that performance. And you can only do that when you're looking at, like you say, behaviors are going to help people actually get to that point, get to the outcome, but sustain it for a long time.
Absolutely.
Because I'm curious, I know Future Super obviously they're focused on, ethical management of money, like sustainability, environmental causes, things like that. So maybe your kind of definition of high performance might differ in the environment that you're in now. Have you found that it's changed over the course of your career?
Yeah, I think in maybe other organizations, I think when outcome is maybe measured more than behaviors, so people get rewarded, I guess, for their output. If the focus maybe is more on, hitting your OKRs, hitting your KPIs, rather than kind of more holistically how you got there. And I guess the culture that you're creating to be able to get there. And I think that goes a long way, back to the culture that is created in the business itself. And so I think that, by virtue of, we do have a real focus on well-being at Future Group. It gives us the space and time, I guess, to focus more on those behaviors as a part of high performance, so that we are creating the right culture for people to perform well, rather than just measuring and promoting and, creating a culture of just, mowing over people to get where we need to get to. And I think ultimately, that creates a better picture overall.
How do you implement processes then, or systems, or culture? Because culture is obviously a massive word, but how do you kind of tease it down to make sure that your team can perform at the best, both from like a well-being perspective, but more of like an outcomes performance perspective as well?
Yeah. So I think it's, it's really about really understanding, I think, when your team is performing well, and then also staying well as well. So I think, the way that I think about this, and I think we think about this at Future Group as well, is that, trust comes first. We treat people as adults, and ultimately, we assume good intent. And that matters a lot at Future Group, I think, because, we are remote first, that's by choice. We don't have those physical cues to kind of be able to assess how people are going in terms of their performance and their well-being. So I think, there's probably two sides of it. So there's a performance side of things and there's a wellness side of things. So, when it comes to kind of assessing performance and whether or not the team's performing well and whether it's working, I think the first one is really probably looking at the individual and some of those behaviors. We talked before, in terms of the high performance behaviors around proactivity and motivation. And some of my cues would be, are my team coming to one-on-ones ready to go? Are they asking questions? Are they asking me for things that they need so that they can unblock themselves. A big one with my teams, I'll always say, is I'm always saying, bring me solutions, not just problems. And I think they're really good cues that, that the team is performing well. And then I also think you take it a bit more macro to kind of go and look at the team, right? So how are the team interacting with each other? Like what is the quality of the debate in the room? Are they pushing each other, or am I having to drive it all the time? Are decisions landing? Are they making decisions, or are they waiting for me to land decisions? And so I think that's, from a performance perspective, how we kind of monitor whether this environment is set up for that performance. But I think well-being also really plays directly into performance. I think somebody who is well in themselves just has that headroom to perform at those higher levels. And that's a massive focus here at Future Group. We have a very deliberate well-being framework that it's not just lip service. We have some really a lot of policies that we put in place to support that. So, we obviously have all the standard policies, but we've really upped the ante, right? So, we've got menstrual leave, menopausal leave, gender affirmative. We're very big on self-care. So we have a bi-monthly self-care day that's really strongly encouraged. All our leaders model it really openly. So it's really obvious that we have that focus there, and we measure it as well. Obviously, a lot of organizations measure engagement, but in our last engagement survey, we had 97% of our people say that wellbeing is a priority at Future Group, and that's massive for an engagement score. I think to go back to what you were saying around, how do you kind of, set up the processes? How do you kind of manage all of that? I think that's where the wicked problem kind of comes in. Because yes, performance and well-being mostly to go hand in hand, but I think where it can get tricky is too much well-being potentially tips into comfort. And, one of the things that you hear a lot is that growth happens when you're outside of your comfort zone. So I think it's, as a leader, it's then my job to create, that environment that helps the team actually perform, and balance off that well-being, and then, be able to show those high performance behaviors.
Is that just a continuous conversation that you're having to have out loud to kind of manage expectations, like you say, of things? Like, I think it is, I have a personal belief as well, is similar, that I think in order to perform well in any domain, sport, business, whatever it is, you do need to be holistically well in yourself, mentally, physically, and then you can perform at your best. How, as a manager though, do you kind of balance, okay, like the wellness side of it is very important, but at the end of the day, there's a job to be done there as well. Do you think that just having open, honest conversations with people, I'm assuming that each individual is going to be so different as well. And as I'm kind of talking out loud now, I'm thinking the bigger your team grows, the harder that challenge probably is as well, right? Have you experienced some of those things?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think, I think it's about being able to kind of, I guess, recognize when that is happening as well. How do you first being able to kind of recognize when there is an issue? And you should be doing that as a leader, I guess, before you start to get to the point where the results aren't coming in, right? Before things start slipping. Right. I have a core belief that I guess no one wakes up in the morning wanting to come to work and perform badly. It comes back to that good intent that I always try to, everyone leads with good intent. So when when performance does drop, there is a reason. And I think that's up to the leader. It's our role as a leader to find that reason before you actually just go, you're not performing. So, in terms of that conversation, I think it's about, being able to diagnose before you intervene. And it probably comes in a couple of forms. So, as you were kind of mentioning around that conversation, I think firstly, you have to have that really strong relation with each of your, each member of your team to the point where you actually know their tells. So you can tell when somebody's spiraling, when someone's going off course or not, just not themselves. And someone actually said to me recently that every one of your team members is really different. And I'm like, yeah, I know. That's deliberate, right? A diverse team is a strong one. But because they're different, the way I support each of them is different as well. So, they know I've got their back, so I can have those open conversations with them. And they're quite brutally honest sometimes, right? So, and vice versa. We're having that open transparency and trust within your team and within your relationships to be able to have those conversations to go, what's going on here? And so I
Yeah.
think that's one thing in terms of the one-on-one kind of leadership side of things. But I think also, and maybe this is something that isn't done as much, is looking in your own backyard.
Oh,
Sometimes a performance problem is actually a symptom of a structural root cause. So, maybe it's the way work is structured, your expectations on a particular person, what you're asking of them. So sometimes the leader is actually creating the problem, and it's not a popular theory, I guess, from a leadership perspective, but sometimes it's us, and the fix is not the person, it's the structure. And I think this is where we need to come back to how we create the environment for high performance, and so that people are able to display and enact those behaviors that we talked about.
yeah. I think something that I'm hearing that, like, the way that you describe your leadership style and how you are is someone that is super dialed in. And I think that's something that got to be explicit about, because I don't think that everyone is like that. I think, and we've had, many conversations in the past, so I do know that you're someone that is close to your people. But I think sometimes you can be in organizations where, to your point, the structure might not allow it, or the
Mm,
expectations on a leader is so much that they can't possibly be across everything, and it sets them up for failure. Because I think in order to diagnose the problem, like you said, be close enough to understand each individual to know if they're drifting off course, it takes a
mm,
leader to be actually super dialed in. So I think that's something
mm.
that's worth emphasizing as well, that, if you're leading a team, you need to have your own capacity to be able to do those things before you can even think about figuring out what the problem is. And because if it is like a performance issue, or if it's a well-being issue, it's going to take different interventions, I imagine. And I just think you need to be so close to your team members to be able to know what's going on. And I think it comes very
Yeah.
naturally to you, or maybe, over the course of your career, it's just something that you now do as second nature.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it also comes down to the kind of person you are as well. Like, I think
Mm.
I have a philosophy of leading with empathy. I'm the kind of person that, you know, is driven by understanding the why, having that curiosity, and just really always coming back to, I really have a strong belief that, not a lot of people go out in the world intending to cause harm. So I think it's how do you work with people to get the best out of them, and sometimes that's about, really taking the time to understand that person and creating the space and the trust, to be able to work with that person, more one on one. And I think that's how you get the best out of people, right? It's about
Right.
having, I come back to, I don't know if you've seen, this is really off the cuff, but if you saw, there was a video of, I think it was a basketball coach, and it's, she had taken a player off the court, and I don't know basketball coaches' names. If it was a netball player, I would absolutely know. But
Yeah.
she had taken the player off the court, and she was absolutely yelling at her, like she was laying it down. And there was a lot of criticism of that coach, in terms of the way they performed. And it was, there was a similar situation in netball recently in the Mavericks where, the coach Jez Murphy, really laid it down to the team and
Mm.
that we are not performing well enough. But that is a symptom of, or not a symptom, but that's an outcome from the work being done before that moment to set that, to create that culture of trust. And then also understanding that that's what that player or that team needed in that moment to be able
Yeah.
to get them to that next point. And I think that's the way that I try to, approach my relationships, and the way that I work with my team to, to help them to tap into those areas of themselves that, and those high performance behaviors in the workplace as well.
For sure. I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't know the names either, but the
Mm,
player in the end in support of the coach as well, and said, that's what I
yeah,
need. And she came back after that absolute grilling and performed really well in the rest of the game.
yeah,
So, and that
absolutely.
comes back to your point, I think, of the trust that you have between
Mm,
player coach, or, leader, employee. So it's super interesting. Shifting gears a little bit, because I know obviously AI is on everybody's agenda at the moment, and I'm really keen to get your take on it.
mm.
From an AI perspective, emerging technology, where are you seeing the value at the moment? within your team, or even within if it's in your own workflow? Like, where are you seeing the value?
So I'm not sure if it's so much about seeing the value just yet, but I think it's more about just maybe the approach that I'm wanting to take with this at the moment. And you're exactly right. Now, I was actually having a conversation with one of my peers the other day. She's like, "Oh, every conversation I have at the moment is about AI." And it's true because it's such a big factor. It's a real unknown, and everyone's starting to dive into it, and I'm leaning into it in particular as well. But I think the take that I'm, the way that I'm approaching it is not necessarily where am I going to get the value from it, but how do I, how do I approach it? So myself, and then also this is something that we do at Future Group as well in terms of AI, is we're approaching it in the context of being a growth lever and not a cost lever. So I actually think a lot of leaders are asking kind of a similar question that you're asking in terms of, where are we going to see the value from it, and or where can we use it to make us leaner? And I actually think that even though it is moving so fast and there is so much you can do with it right now, it's probably the wrong question to ask. I think that the right question is, how does AI free up our people to do better work, and what does the role and the human in that role become? So the way that I'm framing it is, I'm not starting with how do we use AI to go faster or to automate all our workflows. I'm starting with the role and the person. So what does the product manager or a designer or engineer, what does that role of the future look like? And I kind of look at it in, there's two sets of skills in that role of the future. So the first one is obviously the human skills that just in reality at the moment, AI just can't replace them. So if I think about that in the context of product management, that's judgment, prioritization, stakeholder management is huge, right? Storytelling associated with that. And really, particularly in our business, that member empathy. AI can't actually feel what our members feel and have that help them drive their decisions. So that's the human skills. But then I think this is the new part of the roles that we need to prepare our people for. And that's the AI skills, the actual skills. And that comes with, if you look across product management, there's things like, prototyping. Obviously, a product manager can create a more sophisticated prototype these days. They can start off early stage designs, working prototypes, and gets things happening faster. But I actually think, and this is across all industries, now that we've been starting to experiment with bringing it into workflows, the most underestimated AI skill that we need to train our teams on is prompting. So I think the quality of what comes out of AI is so dependent on the quality of what goes in. And that's not just data, it's the prompt. What are we asking it to do? And I think that the kicker is at the moment, as we are starting to see AI roll out, across different workflows, we're actually seeing a lot of slop. I think, I've actually asked one of our designers to create a Slack AI slop emoji because it's it's something that we're seeing a lot more of. Yeah. But the thing is, I think with that, the problem is that, we're looking at AI to decrease our workload. But because you're having to go back and clean it up, slop is increasing the workload. So that's where I think if we're coming back to the role and what this role of the future looks like, how do we not just apply AI to workflow, but how do we apply AI to a role and really focus on the person and the way that they need to be upskilled in AI. And so, like, if you maybe take this and go in a cost lever framing, is more looking at how do we replace the workflow with AI. But a growth lever framing is we will grow your skills, and then by growing your skills, you will then bring AI back into the work that you're doing, but in the right way. And so it's a similar thing, I guess, to what we were just talking about in terms of high performance. So if you have all of the behaviors, you'll see the outputs. And I think it's the same here. If you skill the team up around AI, the advantages will naturally then flow into the workflow.
Do you see, just so I understand it as well, if you're looking at it as more as a cost lever, obviously the efficiency is something that you're going to be measuring, right? But if you're looking at it more from a growth lever, what are you seeing on the other end? Are you still seeing?
Yes. Again, and this is kind of where I tie back again to the high performance conversations, We talked about what, a different view of high performance might be. You're seeing the OKRs, you're seeing the KPIs being hit. But maybe what you're seeing as a result of that, just that focus on the OKRs and the KPIs, is that the culture suffers. And I think it's the same thing with AI. If you're just focusing on efficiency measures and really
Yeah.
looking at it as a cost measure, what you're seeing then is the impact on that, in terms of your team themselves.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we see with AI is a lot of anxiety around AI. It's understandable, right? Because it's really well publicized, particularly in
Mhm.
the technology and the product industries, is that there's been big redundancies across a lot of businesses because of AI. And this, you'd be silly to not think that people aren't going to think about this. And often what this can lead to is a real hesitation to pick the tools up and start experimenting with it. So I think that's why I'm being so deliberate about how, from a growth perspective, are we really building our team members and redefining our roles to introduce AI into it. And then that, the fact that our team members are so skilled in being able to use AI, that then they're then implementing it into their workflow, but then the output is not only the efficiencies, but it's also higher quality, and it's also a better culture, and a better, more high performing team. Because
Yeah.
again, tying it all together, well-being comes back in terms of how, culture and how your team's performing.
Sure. I think on that, like thinking about it from an identity perspective, if I felt as though technology was threatening a part of my role that I kind of identify as, like, let's take if I'm a designer, if I think that that technology is going to replace an aspect of it, the anxiety will creep in. Whereas if
Mm.
it's like the approach that you're taking to maybe empower people to look at their role, look at the work that they're doing, where can you use this to kind of help improve whatever it is that you're trying to do in your day to day, giving people that feeling that they are more in control than they realize.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think also the reality is, and maybe this is again a bit of a controversial view, but it just comes back to, I guess, who I am and how I show up as a leader. But I think if you think about it, your people aren't going to work with you forever,
Yeah.
and regardless of how they leave the business, I believe that as leaders, we have a personal responsibility to set our people up for success, not only for what they do here and how they help us move forward as a team, as a business, but also in whatever's next for them. So that might not be a traditional view, but kind of as a human, and somebody who's been entrusted by these people as their leader, I think that's something that we need to take on board. And so I think also when people see that you're taking that more holistic approach to, look at how we're going to be not only just introducing all of these tools and creating these efficiencies, but making sure that it is big part of their development plan, and making sure that they're set up for success in the future. You create that trust, you create that
Mm.
culture, and you create that environment for high performance.
Do you think you've mentioned anxiety, but do you think there's anything else that you're seeing, and maybe it's not even happening, just like a prediction on how AI might impact teams from that human perspective really negatively? Like, have you thought much about that? Have you
Yeah.
seen it crop up already, regardless of whether it's your team or, other teams that you're kind of close to? Have you seen quite negative impacts emerge?
Yeah, and I think that definitely have. I think there's probably a couple of things there. The first one I've referred to before, and that's AI slop. One of the traps I think that we could find ourselves in with this is, and a lot of places have actually been caught out without doing the right diligence on an output from AI, is that we almost outsource our cognitive thinking a little bit,
Mm.
because we let AI do the heavy lifting on things where the human skills are required. And that's why I think it's so important to identify and make sure that people have got the human and the AI skills. And so I think that's probably a really, really big risk. And it's not just AI slop, I guess, in work output. And this is a really interesting one from a remote work perspective. But
Mm.
when they outsource communication to AI, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't seen more than one Teams message, and maybe I've actually done it myself as well, more than one kind of Slack message that is maybe a heavier subject, or maybe be something that's a bit complex that hasn't been written by AI. There's a situation where one of the guys in my team sent me something and it was really long, and I was like, okay, I'm going to run this through my AI, and then I'm going to get AI to describe it to me, and then I'm going to get AI to write the response. And then we kind of chatted about it later, and it was so ironic because our AIs were talking to each other. And I think what could potentially happen in that situation is we lose that, I guess, some of that, that engagement at that level. There's actually a meme out there, or have seen a meme. I'm talking about a lot about memes today. But there is a meme out there going, I'm going to take this email and I'm going to run it through AI, and then AI is going to write the next email. So we're just kind of talking to each other through AI. And so I think, if we start to kind of tie it back to the human side of things, I think that's probably one of the risks, around, we're starting to outsource a lot of that cognitive thinking and even some of
Mhm.
that emotional thinking as well to AI. I mean, I keep coming back to that is why we not need to be very deliberate about how we skill up our teams with AI.
Yeah.
Because if you're going in with, a team that isn't well versed in how to use it, and doesn't have some of those core skills, they're going to be lazy with it.
Yeah.
Or they're not going to use it to the extent that they need to use it. And then that's when things get really messy.
I think it's really interesting because it's from a personal perspective. Like I use it, to your point, when you're trying to offload that cognitive kind of ability, I
Yeah.
use it sometimes and then I think to myself, I didn't need to ask AI that. I knew the answer. I went to it, one, laziness, but two, could it have been maybe a bit of self-doubt and you want someone to reinforce what you're thinking? And then you might go into a conversation with a false sense of confidence because your AI told you that you were right when really it's just reflecting what you're saying. So I think there's even a bit, and I really check myself on it and make sure I'm only using it, in certain contexts, because I don't want it to creep into a point where you rely on it so much, but you also then build up confidence based on what
Yeah.
it's telling you. So I think you're
Yeah.
right. Like, kind of extrapolate, move forward 5 years. Like imagine if we rely on it so heavily, how much it is just kind of AI talking to AI instead of humans thinking, using their
Yeah.
judgment, using their emotions as well. It's,
Yeah.
yeah, could turn into
I mean,
quite this.
and I think that comes back to how I guess how you measures the wrong word, but like how, like when you're starting to look at that at performance, starting to bring some of those things in,
Mm,
because I think, if everything that you put out there is AI slop, how are you holding your team accountable for that, right? How are you looking at the quality of the output rather than, again, we come back to efficiency. There's so much efficiency that comes with it, but what's the quality of the output, right?
mm,
So how do you kind of hold that accountability as a part of the performance? And keep coming back to those high performance behaviors that I'm accountable for what I put out there, and I stand by what I put out there as being high quality. And then also making sure that, again, those AI skills to have that, be able to review what's being put out there. So I think
mm,
the outcome will show. None of that's being done properly. That will be evident in the quality of the outcome. But we
yeah,
as leaders need to not only, set our teams up for success with the right skills, but also be onto that behavior as well, in making sure that what's coming out is actually as quality, as if it was that own person, even though it's coming out at speed.
yeah. Agreed. Before I let you go, just one kind of ending question or closing question. Is there anything about leadership or how you lead that you used to believe that you don't anymore? If you had to like cast your mind back to Candice as a new leader, something that you thought leadership was that now you just really have abandoned?
I think I used to think, kind of coming up, and I think this is a common kind of misconception, is when you're climbing kind of the ladder, I think a lot of people look at, people want the title, they want the glory of the title, they want the pay. I think, and, they think, I'm the boss, and, I can make some of these decisions. And I did have a leader once, or a mentor once, who was like, do you really want to do that? Do you really want to lead teams? Do you really
Mm,
want to manage people? And I think what I underestimated, back when I was kind of coming through the ranks and had some, really high ambitions in terms of wanting to grow my career, is around how much people management, how hard people management actually is. And I think the thing that I say to particularly people in design and product is, you're very good at the moment. You're enacting your craft, and you're able to, you're really working within your craft. But you've got ambitions to be in a leadership role. But once you get into that leadership role, it becomes less about the craft and it becomes more about the people. And
Yeah.
so the way that you work actually has to shift. And you don't just become this person that is able just to tell everybody what to do and have this big sense of self-empowerment. And I feel really good about myself because I'm the head of, and you must respect me. I think what I've discovered as I've kind of gotten here is that doesn't work.
Mm.
And it is more about, being, flexible and curious and being malleable in terms of how you work with people and how you get the best out of people. And sometimes, that comes at the expense of yourself. And, so it's not necessarily about you anymore. It's about them, because your role is no longer to get the work done. Your role is to help them to get the work done.
Yeah, I've had many conversations with people that have been in leadership roles a couple of years, maybe even longer, and they've been really honest about, look, it's not for me. Like, I want to go back to the craft.
Yeah,
And it's
absolutely.
not something that I'm passionate about. I think it's such an important role because you have such a great impact on the people that you work with. Everybody says, I mean, your manager sometimes, I think, impacts your life more than your partner can. So I think it's a
Yeah.
really important role. And I think there is no shame in, if you get to a point where you feel like, actually, this is not for me, to step away.
No, I think
Yeah.
there's definitely a crossroads that you can take. You can either go into craft
Yeah.
expertise or leadership, and it's not for everyone.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's always an amazing conversation with you. I always leave thinking about 100 different things, but also feeling quite inspired. So thank you.
Oh, no problem. Really lovely to chat, Nick.
That's it for today's episode. If you found this valuable, please share it with a friend or a colleague. To connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Nicole Howe. Thanks for listening.